I have another story. This is from the Cactus Summit of things that have changed in my perspective over time. Cactus Summit was, I think, 300, 400 people. It was a pretty exciting, big in Santa Clara's convention center. And somebody, I think it was from Disney, stood up in the corner and said, "Hey, all this is really cool, but I need some help trying to make whatever work." And somebody else stood up across the room. It's like, "This is open source. If you have a problem with it, you need to fix it." And I was sitting in the back. I'm like, "Wow, that's super powerful." This user's empowered to go fix and whatever. And from an OpenStack, open source perspective, it's exactly the right answer. From a user perspective, now that I, seeing myself as that poor person who came here. Now they came to an open source conference, they should know, but they're sitting, "I need help fixing your software and making it work." And you're basically telling that person, "It's not my problem. You figure it out." Mm-hmm. There's a balance in any of these projects to figuring out how to solve somebody's problem so they'll use your project, and creating a community where people are incented to participate and help and do what they can. And I think that's just an ongoing dilemma, right? There's a mix. A lot of times you'd say, "Oh, the vendors, they should have, there should have been 3 vendors standing around that user trying to help them at the end of the day," and that might be the right answer. But a lot of open source communities get very wary of that sort of immediate commercialization, and it's not that welcoming to a new user either. And I don't know. I don't have simple answers for this. These are just these are sort of those stories of what it looks like as you're building a culture for how a project should operate, and learning that what you see when you're inside the culture is awesome might look like outside the culture as very problematic or unfriendly.
I think that's one of the really confusing things about open source even today, right? In that, what is the relationship of an end user that is non-technical in an open source project? I mean, I was taught in the beginning that, open source is developed by developers for developers, right? And if you want documentation, go read the code, because that's the only real way you're going to find documentation, right? And and with that mindset, that too has a purpose, right? And that use is not bad. But as you say, I mean, well, as far as that goes, in the Cactus days of OpenStack, developers couldn't figure out how to run OpenStack.
No, they couldn't. No,
it was a challenge back in the day just for developers, and it was part of that complexity of the various modules that were helping that along.
And just to add to the timeline, the Cactus days were in 2012. So I think, or 2011, 2012, something along those lines. I think it was kind of.
I actually think even earlier, 2010.
2010.
No,
yeah.
And I think 2010 was the launch. 2010 was.
And then maybe settle on 2011.
2011 sounds right. I'd have to get my old Cactus t-shirts.
Oh yeah, that would be fun. We have a lot of cool t-shirts from that community.
Collection. Yep.
And it just I mean, it's interesting how we are talking about that developer user relationship, and I can still see almost the exact same conversations happening in communities. So I have a lot of questions to all the stories that you talked about. One immediate one to just this user developer relationship, as you had this experience, and then also eventually you had the realization that maybe this is not exactly the way to go. Did you have any opportunity to change this kind of relationships? I don't know if you were a user after that in another project and community where you could use that experience to change the interaction, or again, maybe
I actually
maybe
tried. No, I mean, I tried when Kubernetes was forming, and I was an early Kubernetes user. Because of the pattern, I actually started a cluster. We called it cluster ops, SIG cluster ops. And so early on in that community, I stepped in and was running the special interest groups for operators so that we could have these conversations and try and do that. And what we did inside of OpenStack, we still kept trying to do inside of Kubernetes. It turns out to be really hard. Is in OpenStack, we built a project called Crowbar. It was designed to install OpenStack as part of this sort of challenge, right? It's how you help people get moving, not from a developer perspective, but from a user perspective. And OpenStack had a lot of moving parts, and we automated all of those pieces. Incredibly powerful experience from that perspective. And so, that's been almost, just an ongoing story for me over the last 15 years now, on trying to sort of improve that out of the box operational experience and the day two operational experience for users using the software. And I've really put a lot of time in there. The interesting thing is it's very hard to make successful. Like the Kubernetes cluster ops work that I did turned into some great conversations with people who were using Kubernetes in general, but we had a lot of trouble finding repeatable operations patterns that people would keep using. And then that group sort of split into, there's this cluster admin tool that they built to try and sort of standardize that stuff. And that ultimately became their cluster API work, which is trying to sort of standardize, but it's been, I guess almost a decade of work there, and they're barely at a point where they have a standard operating practice for how these systems go. The challenge with the difference between writing software and using software, especially we're talking about infrastructure software, is the permutations of running software is very difficult and very personal, and versus writing software, you're sort of building the software, you can control it, it's a known input, known output. When you start talking about operating it, somebody's choice of, Dell versus HP versus Lenovo, or the operating system they're using, or the number of drives, or their network topology, those are all logical choices, but there's no standard, and the whole system falls apart. And what was hard in an open source community is to sit down with an operator who's doing something. If you're an operator and they're an operator, for you to sit down in a room with them and help them solve a problem means you're like deep in the weeds of their ops issues. And what I found is that it's really not community behavior for people to sit down and do that for other people. And so a lot of the open source ecosystem work breaks down when you get into how I'm using something. That ends up, a paid relationship, like a vendor relationship, ends up being a much more pragmatic. It's like, your friends can be your therapist, but they're not going to do the right job as paying a professional. And that sounds like a funny analogy, but in some ways, ops it can be like that. And it's the whole ecosystems don't work unless people invest time in helping solve each other's problems. Fundamentally, open source boils down to that. But if it's too expensive, if I spend all my time helping you solve your problems, or that's all I'm doing, a lot of open source people get burned out because they never do the stuff that they're supposed to do. They end up helping everybody else do their stuff. And that leads to burnout, and you can end up with a very short, or out of a job because you're spending all your time helping your competitors or other people get their stuff working, and you never do your own job.